Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of a luxurious hotel in the heart of the city, sunlight reflecting off his sleek, tailored suit. As he made his way toward the gleaming black SUV waiting for him, a frail, thin, pale little girl suddenly darted forward and clung tightly to his leg. Before Shaq could utter a word, the girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with panic and desperation, a look that would change everything. Can you guess what happened next? If you love inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. The golden hues of sunset bathed the glass skyscrapers downtown as the day drew to a close. Shaquille O'Neal, dressed impeccably in his suit, emerged from the grand glass doors of a luxury hotel. His towering figure immediately caught the attention of the bustling crowd. The charity event he had attended had been a resounding success, and now his sleek black SUV was parked at the curb, ready to take him home. Amid the urban hustle, the honking of cars and the constant flow of pedestrians, Shaq kept a relaxed smile as he chatted with his driver, Marcus. He was just bending down to step into the car when suddenly a small figure darted out from the crowd. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her scrawny frame accentuated by bare, dirt-streaked feet. What struck Shaq most was her pallid, sickly complexion. Without a word, she clung tightly to his leg, her body trembling, her wide eyes darting nervously over her shoulder as though fleeing something terrifying. Shaq crouched down, his deep, warm voice cutting through the tension. "Are you okay? What's going on?" The girl remained silent, avoiding his gaze. Her tiny hands clutched his pant leg as if clinging to a fragile thread of hope. Before Shaq could press further, an angry voice rang out from across the street. "Stop right there, you little troublemaker!" A middle-aged man in a grease-stained apron came hurrying toward them, his flushed face contorted with annoyance. Startled, the girl let go of Shaq's leg and bolted into the crowd, disappearing so quickly that Shaq only caught a fleeting glimpse of her retreating figure. The man approached, panting heavily, seemingly oblivious to who he was addressing. "That kid. She's always hanging around my shop, never buys anything, just touches everything and bothers my customers. This time I'm calling the cops." Shaq raised an eyebrow, his irritation barely veiled. He responded in a calm yet firm tone. "Did she steal something from you?" The man faltered, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "Well, not exactly, but she keeps pacing around, staring at the shelves, making my customers uneasy. Kids like her just bring trouble." Shaq crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. His mind replayed the haunting look in the girl's eyes, a mix of fear, desperation, and a silent plea for help. The man opened his mouth to complain further, but froze when he realized he was speaking to Shaquille O'Neal. Stammering an apology, he quickly walked away. Shaq remained rooted beside the SUV, his eyes scanning the direction the girl had fled. A deep sense of curiosity and compassion stirred within him. One question lingered in his mind. What was she running from? And why does she need help so badly? Shaquille O'Neal stood still for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the little girl who had just vanished into the crowd. A strange feeling washed over him, a pull he couldn't ignore. Turning to his driver, Marcus, his voice was steady and deep. "Marcus, slow down. We need to find that girl." Marcus raised an eyebrow but quickly nodded. Having worked for Shaq for years, he was used to unexpected requests from his boss, even if this one felt unusual. The black SUV rolled slowly through the bustling streets of downtown. Outside the window, the cacophony of the city buzzed. The chatter of pedestrians, the honking of horns, and the relentless rhythm of urban life blending into a chaotic symphony. Shaq kept his eyes glued to the sidewalks, scanning every alley and corner, searching for the small figure with the shaven head that had etched itself into his memory. "Where do you think she might have gone?" Marcus asked, his gaze fixed on the traffic ahead. "I don't know," Shaq replied, his eyes never leaving the sidewalk. "But she needs help. Something spooked her so badly she had to run. I need to know what's going on." After nearly 10 minutes of searching, Shaq spotted a small figure huddled on the curb near a convenience store. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized her. Emma, that's what he had begun calling her in his mind, even though he didn't know her real name, was sitting on the sidewalk, clutching a small paper cup with a few coins inside. Her frail shoulders trembled under a thin, tattered jacket. The passers-by moved hurriedly around her, barely noticing her presence as if she were just another invisible piece of the cityscape. Shaq signaled Marcus to stop the car and stepped out. With his towering frame and commanding presence, his appearance instantly drew a few curious glances. But his focus was solely on the girl. Walking slowly so as not to frighten her, Shaq crouched down, his deep voice soft and gentle. "Hi there. Are you okay?" Emma looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and fear. But this time, she didn't run. She simply sat there, clutching the paper cup in her hands like a lifeline. Shaq sat down on the curb, lowering himself to her level to minimize the intimidating height difference. He offered a small smile. "My name's Shaq. Can you tell me your name?" After a moment's hesitation, she mumbled, "Emma." Shaq nodded, his gaze filled with empathy. "Emma, I saw you earlier. Do you need any help?" Emma didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted nervously around as if expecting someone to appear out of nowhere. Shaq followed her gaze and noticed a man standing across the street, glaring in their direction. He looked like the store owner from earlier, his expression hard and accusatory. "Are you afraid of him?" Shaq asked, tilting his head slightly toward the man. Emma didn't reply, but the way she tightened her grip on the cup said it all. Taking a deep breath, Shaq turned to Marcus, who was leaning against the SUV. "Marcus, keep an eye on things. Don't let anyone come near us." When Shaq's expression softened again, Emma seemed to sense that she was safe. Several minutes passed in silence before she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need help, but not money." Shaq leaned closer, his concern deepening. "What do you need, Emma? Tell me." Emma hesitated, then slowly rolled up her sleeve, revealing a large bruise and an odd discoloration running along her thin arm. A chill ran down Shaq's spine. "What's this, Emma? Did someone hurt you?" Emma shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "The doctor said I need medicine, but I don't have money, and no one will help me." In that moment, it felt as though the world around Shaq fell silent. His gaze rested on Emma's trembling shoulders, and he knew he couldn't just walk away. Emma needed him. More than that, she needed someone to care. "I'll help you, Emma," Shaq said firmly. "We're going to fix this right now." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of doubt and the faintest glimmer of hope. For the first time that day, she didn't shy away from his gaze. "Do you promise?" she asked softly. Shaq nodded, his expression resolute. "I promise." Shaquille O'Neal looked deeply into Emma's eyes, where a glimmer of hope had just sparked after his promise. Slowly, standing up, he extended his hand toward her. "Come on, Emma. I'll take you somewhere safe." Emma hesitated for a moment, but the steady look in his eyes and his warm smile gave her a sense of comfort. She reached out and took his hand, her small, trembling fingers dwarfed in his large palm. Marcus quickly opened the door of the SUV, and Shaq helped Emma climb inside. The SUV cruised through the bustling streets, the atmosphere inside tense yet quiet. Sitting next to Emma, Shaq observed her closely, noticing how her frail hands clutched at the hem of her shirt as if trying to suppress her fear. "Emma, where do you live?" Shaq asked gently, though his voice betrayed his concern. "At St. Helena Orphanage," she replied softly, "but they don't have enough money to take care of me." Shaq frowned, leaning forward. "Can't take care of you? What do you mean?" Emma hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor of the vehicle. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing a dark bruise stretching along her pale, dry skin. The deep, unnatural discoloration sent a chill down Shaq's spine. "The doctor said I'm sick. It's a type of cancer," Emma said, her voice trembling. "I need medicine, but the orphanage can't afford it. I thought if I could collect enough money, maybe they'd help me." Shaq stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and heartbreak. A child so thin, so fragile, burdened with a struggle that no one should face alone. "You've been asking for money to save yourself?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Emma nodded, her eyes filled with helplessness. "I don't want to bother anyone, but I don't want to die." Shaq turned to Marcus, meeting his gaze in the rearview mirror, his voice firm with resolve. "Marcus, drive straight to the nearest hospital. We can't wait." Marcus nodded and accelerated without a word. Shaq turned back to Emma, gently placing one of his large hands on her thin shoulder. "Listen to me, Emma," he said, his voice warm yet steady. "You're not doing this alone anymore. I'll take care of everything, okay? All you need to do is be strong and trust me." Emma looked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes but now accompanied by a flicker of hope. "You'll really help me?" Shaq smiled, his expression sincere and reassuring. "I promise, and I never break my promises." When the SUV pulled up to the hospital, Shaq scooped Emma into his arms, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by. She felt as light as a feather in his steady embrace. Inside, the medical staff immediately recognized Shaquille O'Neal, but before anyone could utter a word, he firmly stated, "This child needs to be examined immediately. She can't wait another minute." The doctors rushed Emma into an examination room while Shaq stood in the hallway, a storm of emotions swirling within him. He thought about how Emma had been fighting alone, not just against her illness but against the indifference and cruelty of the world. Marcus approached him hesitantly. "Shaq, what are you really planning to do? This kid doesn't just need a little money. She needs a long-term solution." Without hesitation, Shaq turned to him, determination blazing in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes, Marcus. No child should have to fight to survive on their own." When the examination room door opened and a doctor stepped out with a grave expression, Shaq knew that his journey with Emma was only beginning. The SUV sped through the bustling streets, street lights reflecting off the windows casting faint streaks of light across Shaquille O'Neal's pensive face. Emma sat in the back seat, leaning against the window, her shallow breaths fueling Shaq's mounting concern. "How are you feeling, Emma?" Shaq asked gently, though his voice betrayed his tension. Emma tried to manage a weak smile. "I'm okay. just a little tired." The car turned a corner, and Shaq glanced back at her. Her eyelids were starting to droop, her head tilted slightly to one side. He could feel the fragility of the young girl, as if a strong gust of wind could carry her away. When the car pulled up in front of a run-down building, an orphanage where Emma lived, Shaq opened the door, ready to help her out. But as soon as he touched her shoulder, Emma collapsed into his arms. "Emma!" Shaq shouted, his voice filled with panic. He scooped her up, his strong arms effortlessly cradling her small, feather-light frame. "Marcus, drive to the nearest hospital. Hurry!" Shaq yelled over his shoulder, his worry etched deeply into his face. The SUV tore through the streets, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Inside, Shaq held Emma tightly, feeling the faint rhythm of her breaths. "Stay with me, Emma. I'm right here," he murmured, as if his words alone could keep her conscious. At the hospital, medical staff rushed to take Emma, placing her on a stretcher and wheeling her straight to the emergency room. Shaq followed closely, each heavy step bearing the weight of his world. "Doctor, please help her," Shaq pleaded, his voice raw with urgency. A nurse placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to reassure him. "We'll do our best, but you'll need to wait outside." Reluctantly, Shaq stopped, his eyes fixed on Emma as she disappeared through the large doors marked Emergency Unit. As Shaq waited, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair hurried into the hospital lobby. Spotting Shaq, she paused, then approached with a look of concern. "Are you the one who brought Emma here?" she asked, her voice warm but tinged with worry. Shaq nodded. "Yes, she fainted on the way. And you are?" "I'm Margaret, the manager of the orphanage where Emma lives," she replied, her sad eyes lowering to the floor. "I just got a call from the nurse here. Is she okay?" Shaq shook his head, struggling to remain composed. "I don't know. The doctors are still examining her." Margaret sighed deeply, her trembling hands clutching an old, worn handbag. "Emma has endured so much. I'm afraid she can't hold on much longer without help." Shaq met her gaze, sensing the despair in her voice. "Can you tell me what's going on? What's wrong with her?" Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down, her eyes heavy with years of hardship. "Emma was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer 6 months ago. The malignant tumor has spread to her lymphatic system. The doctor said if she doesn't get treatment soon, she won't survive, but—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. "But the orphanage doesn't have the money." Shaq finished the sentence she couldn't bring herself to say. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We've tried our best, but funds are tight. Emma overheard the doctors talking and figured out we couldn't afford the treatment. Since then, she's been sneaking out, trying to beg for money, hoping to save herself. I tried to stop her, but she's so stubborn. She's afraid of being a burden." Shaq felt his heart clench painfully. He recalled the look in Emma's eyes when she said, "I need help, but not money." The scattered pieces of her story came together in his mind, forming a heartbreaking picture of her struggles. At that moment, the emergency room doors swung open. A doctor stepped out, his expression grave. "Are you the one who brought her in?" Shaq nodded, stepping forward. "I'm her guardian. How is Emma, doctor?" The doctor looked at Shaq, his eyes somber. "She's in critical condition. We've stabilized her for now, but Emma needs long-term treatment. The tumor has metastasized and her chances aren't good without immediate intervention." Shaq clenched his fists. Do whatever it takes. I'll cover all the expenses." The doctor looked surprised for a moment, but quickly nodded. "We'll do everything we can." Shaq followed the doctor into the hospital room. As he approached the bed, Emma opened her eyes weakly, her small hand clutching the blanket tightly. "You won't leave me, will you?" she asked, her voice fragile, as though fearing the answer might shatter her last hope. Shaq leaned down, his gaze resolute. "Never, Emma. I promise you." Shaquille O'Neal stood silently beside Emma's hospital bed, his gaze fixed on the small, pale face of the young girl. Her frail voice, "You won't leave me, will you?" echoed repeatedly in his mind. The promises he had uttered were more than just words of comfort. They were vows he knew he couldn't break. The doctor approached, holding Emma's medical file in hand, his expression weary yet professional. "Mr. O'Neal," he began, his voice low and serious, "Emma needs immediate intensive treatment. We've stabilized her for now, but she'll require a series of chemotherapy and radiation therapy to halt the spread of the cancer cells. The costs will be significant, not to mention the recovery process after treatment." Shaq took a deep breath, his eyes locked onto the doctor. "Doctor, I don't care how much it costs. Do everything that needs to be done. Don't hold back on anything. Emma deserves a chance to live." The doctor nodded, slightly surprised by Shaq's determination. "I understand. We'll begin the treatment as soon as we have formal consent." Shaq turned to Mrs. Margaret, who stood quietly nearby with tear-filled eyes. "Mrs. Margaret, I'll take care of all the expenses for Emma, and I want you to know that from now on, she'll get everything she needs to get better." Mrs. Margaret was speechless, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something, but all she could do was nod in gratitude. As the doctor prepared the paperwork, Shaq stepped out of the room and pulled out his phone to contact his manager. He knew this decision would come with consequences once it became public. Sure enough, his phone began buzzing incessantly. Jamie, Shaq's longtime manager, was calling. Shaq sighed and answered. "Shaq, where are you?" Jamie's voice was tense. "The press conference has already started, and you're the guest of honor. Hundreds of people are waiting for you." "Jamie," Shaq replied, his voice calm but resolute, "I can't make it." "Can't make it?" Jamie nearly shouted over the phone. "Do you have any idea what this will do? Contracts, sponsors, your reputation?" Shaq interrupted, his tone firm and unyielding. "Jamie, I don't care about my reputation or contracts right now. There's a little girl fighting for her life, and I'm not leaving until I know she's getting all the help she needs." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Jamie sighed, his voice softening. "I understand. But Shaq, you know there will be consequences." Shaq closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "If there are consequences, I'll face them. But Jamie, sometimes we have to do what's right, even when it's not easy." When Shaq returned to the hospital room, Emma was awake. She turned her head weakly to look at him, her eyes lighting up when she saw him enter. "You came back," she whispered. Shaq smiled and sat down beside her bed. "I told you, didn't I? I'm not leaving you." Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude but also tinged with fear. "I'm scared, Uncle Shaq. I don't know if I can make it." Shaq took her small hand in his gaze steady and reassuring. "Listen to me, Emma. I know this isn't easy, but you're a brave little girl, and you're not fighting this alone. I'll be here every step of the way, every moment. You won't have to do this by yourself." Emma looked up at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Promise?" Shaq nodded, gripping her hand tightly. "I promise. I'll be here until you're healthy again. This is a big game, and we're going to win." In that moment, amidst the steady beeping of machines and the cold hospital lighting, an invisible bond was formed. Shaq wasn't just a celebrity or a stranger who had happened to cross Emma's path. He had become her source of strength, her beacon of hope, and the companion she needed to face the difficult journey ahead. The bright white light from the hospital ceiling cast a clean yet chilling glow over the hallway. Shaquille O'Neal sat silently on a hard plastic chair in the waiting area, his hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the still-closed doors of the operating room. Beside him, Mrs. Margaret sat quietly, her tension evident in the way she clutched her worn-out handbag tightly. Shaq had faced countless high-stakes games in his basketball career, but never had he felt as powerless as he did now, with everything entirely out of his control. While he waited, his phone buzzed incessantly. Texts, emails, and calls from his manager, business partners, and the media poured in. A message from Jamie appeared on the screen. "Shaq, we need to talk. Yesterday's press conference caused some issues." Shaq sighed, picking up the phone, only to set it down again. He couldn't let outside distractions invade his mind right now. Emma needed him, and this was where he had to be. "You don't have to stay here all day." Mrs. Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice gentle yet full of gratitude. "I know you have so many responsibilities. Just getting Emma here was more than enough." Shaq turned to her, his gaze steady. "No, Mrs. Margaret. Emma needs me. I'm staying, no matter how long it takes." Tears welled up in her eyes. "You truly are a remarkable man, Mr. O'Neal." Time seemed to drag on endlessly. Seconds turned into minutes, then hours. Every time the operating room doors swung open and nurses stepped out, Shaq's heart would skip a beat, only to sink when they didn't approach with news about Emma. He began pacing the hallway, his enormous frame taking up most of the space. But no one else in the waiting area said a word. They simply watched the giant man, his face heavy with worry. Finally, after nearly 4 hours, the doors to the operating room opened. The surgeon stepped out, still in scrubs and mask, his eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and professionalism. Shaq rushed forward, his eyes brimming with both hope and fear. "How is Emma, doctor?" The surgeon regarded him for a moment before pulling his mask down to reveal a weary but reassuring smile. "The surgery was successful. We removed the tumor and the affected lymph nodes, but..." "But what?" Shaq's voice was tight with anxiety. The doctor sighed. "Her condition has advanced to stage 3. This means we can't guarantee that all the cancer cells were eliminated. Emma will need extensive chemotherapy and radiation treatments to reduce the risk of recurrence." Shaq took a deep breath, fighting to steady his emotions. He turned to Mrs. Margaret, who had her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "So there's still a chance for her, right?" Shaq asked, his voice resolute. The doctor nodded. "Yes, but it's going to be a long and difficult journey. Emma will need medical care and emotional support." Shaq exhaled deeply, relief flooding his chest. "Thank you, doctor. Do whatever it takes. We won't let her face this alone." When Shaq walked into the recovery room, he saw Emma lying on the hospital bed, her eyes closed, her small face pale but seemingly at peace. The machines around her beeped steadily, a reassuring reminder that she was still fighting. Shaq leaned down and took her frail hand in his. It was cold to the touch, but he felt a surge of emotion coursing through him. "Emma," he whispered, as if she could hear him. "I promised I'd be here, and I'll keep that promise. You're going to get better. I know it." Even though the surgery had gone well, Shaq understood this was only the beginning. A tough, grueling road lay ahead, not just for Emma, but for him as well. Yet in his heart, there was no room for doubt. He had made a promise to fight alongside her, and nothing would stop him from keeping it. Shaquille O'Neal sat in the hospital room, his gaze fixed on Emma, who was sound asleep. The steady beeping of the medical machine surrounding her brought a slight sense of reassurance. But deep inside Shaq, a fire had ignited, not one of anxiety, but of determination. He knew that getting Emma through her surgery was just the first step. Chemotherapy and radiation awaited her, along with the mental and physical challenges no child should face alone. But Shaq realized it wasn't just Emma that troubled him. Behind her story was a larger picture of a struggling community, silent in the face of need. Mrs. Margaret entered the room, her face weary but her eyes lighting up as she saw Shaq by Emma's side. "Emma will be okay," she said softly, attempting a smile. "Thank you for being here for her." Shaq turned to her, his expression serious and reflective. "Mrs. Margaret, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. Not just about Emma, but about your orphanage and the other kids there. I want to do more." Mrs. Margaret tilted her head slightly, surprise evident in her eyes. "You've already done so much, Mr. O'Neal. Bringing Emma here and covering her expenses is something we'll never forget." Shaq shook his head, his voice firm. "Helping just Emma isn't enough. Mrs. Margaret, I want to help all the children at your orphanage, and not just stop there. I want to make sure no child ends up in Emma's situation without someone to step in." Mrs. Margaret stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You mean?" Shaq straightened in his seat, his large hands resting on his knees, his expression resolute. "I want to establish a charity, an organization that not only supports children with critical illnesses, but also improves the living conditions for kids in your orphanage." Mrs. Margaret froze, her trembling hands covering her mouth. "Mr. O'Neal, do you really mean this? It's going to cost a fortune and—" "Money isn't the issue," Shaq interrupted, his voice unwavering. "I've been fortunate to have a successful career and a life many dream of, but none of that matters if I can't use it to help those who need it the most. I want to build a place where no child has to be afraid anymore." A few days later, after Emma had been moved to a general ward, Shaq arranged a private meeting with Mrs. Margaret in the hospital's administrative office. "What does your orphanage need?" Shaq asked directly, his focus unbroken. Mrs. Margaret hesitated for a moment before pulling out a worn folder with aged documents. "We need everything. Our facilities are falling apart. The rooms are unsafe. We don't have a medical room, and our daily meals rely on small donations. Sometimes we even have to cut back on meals to save costs." Shaq flipped through the papers, the images of cracked walls and rusted metal beds burning into his mind. A quiet anger brewed within him, not at Mrs. Margaret or anyone at the orphanage, but at a system that allowed vulnerable children to live in such conditions. "We're going to change this," Shaq said, his voice low and commanding. "I'll fund the renovation of the orphanage, but I want to do more. I'll find a larger, safer plot of land. We'll build a new facility, fully equipped, with a medical room and a playground for the kids." Mrs. Margaret's eyes widened, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mr. O'Neill, this is unbelievable. Why are you doing this?" Shaq smiled, his gaze softening. "Because of Emma. Because every child deserves a chance, and because I know I can." In the weeks that followed, Shaq began detailed planning. He held meetings with contractors, lawyers, and friends in the financial world to kick off the charity. He named the organization Shaq's House of Hope, as a pledge that every child deserves a safe home and a brighter future. But not everything went smoothly. Some of Shaq's business partners started expressing concerns about his new priorities. They feared he was losing focus on his personal career and endorsement deals. A few even warned that this could harm his brand image. In a tense meeting, one branding executive candidly remarked, "Shaq, we respect what you're doing, but you can't solve all the world's problems. You're a sports and entertainment icon, not a full-time philanthropist." Shaq stood up, his towering presence filling the room. He looked each person in the eye and spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "I've built my name to create impact, and this is how I choose to use it. If this makes any of you uncomfortable, I'm prepared to face the consequences, but I will not turn my back on the children who need me." The room fell silent, and no one could find the words to challenge him further. Shaq left the meeting with even greater determination. He knew it wasn't just Emma, but an entire community depending on him, and he wouldn't let them down. When he returned to the hospital, he stopped by Emma's room. She was sitting up in bed, playing with a picture book Mrs. Margaret had brought her. Shaq walked in, his face lighting up with a smile. "Emma," he said, sitting beside her, "we're going to have a new place soon, a real home for you and your friends, and there, no one will ever have to be afraid again." Emma looked at him, her eyes shining with hope. "Promise?" Shaq leaned forward, taking her small hand in his. "I promise." Shaquille O'Neal stepped into the sports store near the hospital, his towering frame nearly filling the narrow aisles. A staff member recognized him immediately, his eyes lighting up as if he had just encountered a legend. "Hey there, Shaq. How can I help you today?" the employee asked, his voice brimming with excitement. Shaq smiled and leaned down slightly to meet the man's gaze. "I need the best basketball you've got, an authentic jersey of mine, and do you have any small gifts for kids?" "Absolutely, sir," the staffer replied without hesitation, quickly guiding Shaq to the display section. In Shaq's mind, Emma's face came vividly into view. He remembered the fear in her eyes the first time they met, but also the determination in her voice when she asked, "Do you promise?" Now, Shaq wanted to do more to bring her some joy and warmth during these difficult times. That afternoon, Shaq returned to the hospital carrying a large bag stuffed with gifts. Before entering Emma's room, he ran into Ms. Margaret chatting with a nurse in the hallway. "Shaq, what's all that you're carrying?" Ms. Margaret asked, her eyes curious. Shaq winked, a broad grin spreading across his face. "Just wait and see. We're throwing a surprise party for Emma today." Ms. Margaret chuckled, the tension in her expression melting away. When Shaq stepped into Emma's hospital room, she was sitting upright against the pillows, her frail arms clutching a worn-out teddy bear. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him. "Hey, Emma, I've got a surprise for you," Shaq announced, his voice full of excitement. He placed the bag on her bed and began pulling out the gifts one by one. First came a basketball signed by him. Emma stared at it, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. I signed it just for you, Shaq said warmly. This ball isn't just for playing. It's a champion's good luck charm. Every time you look at it, remember, you're a warrior too. Emma smiled, a glimmer of pride shining in her eyes. Next, Shaq pulled out an official jersey with his iconic number 34 emblazoned on the back. And this is the uniform of Team Shaq. If you're up for it, you'll be the honorary captain of this team. Emma giggled softly, her face lighting up with joy for the first time in weeks. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Shaq retrieved a DVD and held it up. Now, it's time for a movie night. Have you ever seen Space Jam? Emma shook her head, curiosity flickering in her gaze. Shaq laughed heartily. Well, you're in for a treat. Miss Margaret, could you help me borrow a TV for a bit? Within minutes, Emma's hospital room was transformed into a cozy mini theater. Nurses peeked in out of curiosity, and even a few patients from neighboring rooms asked to join. Shaq sat next to Emma, remote control in hand, ready to start the movie. As the film began, Shaq leaned toward Emma and whispered like he was sharing a secret. Just so you know, some of the moves in this movie were inspired by my actual games. Emma giggled, a light, sweet sound that hadn't been heard in weeks. As the movie played on, Emma became increasingly engrossed, occasionally turning to Shaq to ask about the plays or characters. Each time, Shaq answered with humor, making her laugh so much she couldn't stop smiling. During the climax of the movie, Emma glanced at Shaq and whispered, I'm going to try as hard as you in the NBA Finals. If you can win, so can I. Shaq felt his heart swell with emotion, but he kept his smile steady. He gently patted her hand. That's right, Captain. We always win when we never give up. Later that evening, when the movie ended, Emma had drifted off to sleep, a peaceful smile gracing her face. The jersey Shaq gave her lay beside her, and the signed basketball was tucked neatly at the foot of the bed. Shaq watched her for a moment, his heart brimming with warmth. As he left the room, he turned to Ms. Margaret. See? Sometimes all it takes is a little joy to help us get through the toughest days. Ms. Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. Shaq, you're not just a champion on the basketball court. You're a champion of little hearts like Emma's. Shaq smiled, but in his heart another thought was forming. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of what he could do to change the lives of children like Emma. The next morning, Shaquille O'Neal walked out of the hospital after a sleepless night. A light mist blanketed the sky, but his mood was as bright as the morning sun. He had just spent a memorable evening with Emma, the little girl who had finally begun to smile again after days of fear and uncertainty. As he settled into the car, his phone buzzed incessantly with new notifications. Marcus, Shaq's longtime driver, glanced at him through the rearview mirror with a knowing smile. Boss, you're more famous now than ever before. Shaq raised an eyebrow and unlocked his phone. A series of headlines from news articles flashed across the screen. Shaquille O'Neal brings hope to little Emma, a heartwarming tale. Shaq puts career on hold to help save lives of children in need. He let out a sigh, a mix of pride and discomfort. He hadn't done this for recognition, but if the attention could bring greater support, he was determined to use it to help even more children. In the days that followed, the story of Shaq and Emma spread rapidly across media outlets and social networks. Journalists, charitable organizations, and individuals from all walks of life expressed their admiration. Messages and calls poured in from entrepreneurs, athletes, and even ordinary fans, all asking the same question: how can I help? A young entrepreneur sent a generous donation along with a letter. Shaq, you've inspired me. I want to contribute to making Emma's dreams and those of other children come true. A fellow athlete texted, if you need someone to shoot hoops with the kids, count me in. Even young fans sent handwritten letters, drawings, and small gifts, hoping to be part of this meaningful journey. Motivated by the overwhelming community support, Shaq decided to organize a major fundraiser in the heart of the city. He knew this was not just an opportunity to raise funds, but a chance to spread a message of hope and love. That evening, the event venue sparkled under bright lights, hosting hundreds of attendees, from business leaders and famous artists to everyday citizens. The stage was decorated with a basketball theme, featuring a prominent logo of Shaq's newly established charity, Shaq's House of Hope. Shaq appeared to thunderous applause. He stepped onto the stage, bowed his head in acknowledgement, and took the microphone. Good evening, everyone. I've been fortunate to have a dream career, but I've realized that the most meaningful part of life isn't the titles or the successes. It's how we use those blessings to help others. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight. We're not just helping Emma. We're building a brighter future for hundreds of other children. The room erupted in applause, but Shaq wasn't finished. He turned toward a door on the side of the stage and said, and now, I'd like to introduce someone very special, the little girl who gave me the reason to start this journey. Emma. The door opened, and Emma walked out to a wave of cheers and clapping. She wore Shaq's number 34 jersey and a basketball cap adorned with the charity's logo. Though still frail, her eyes sparkled, and her radiant smile left the audience silent with emotion. Emma joined Shaq on stage, and he bent down to hand her the microphone. She held it tightly, her small but steady voice filling the room. Thank you all for being here. I know I couldn't do this alone, but because of Uncle Shaq and all of you, I know I can win. She paused, taking a deep breath before adding, I will win, for everyone here. The room erupted in applause and cheers, tears streaming down faces, from strangers to Shaq's closest friends. As the event concluded, Shaq and Emma sat together in a quiet corner of the room. Emma looked up at him, her smile tired but content. Today was amazing, Uncle Shaq. I'm not scared anymore. Shaq placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his warm smile lighting up his face. That's because you're a warrior, Emma, and warriors are never alone. That night, Shaq didn't just feel the success of the fundraiser, he felt the deeper meaning of what he was doing. His journey with Emma was only beginning, but with the community's support, he knew anything was possible. In the days following the fundraiser, Shaquille O'Neal continued to visit the hospital regularly to check on Emma. Each time he entered her hospital room, he brought with him an infectious energy, as if his mere presence could sweep away every worry. But it wasn't always easy. The chemotherapy was beginning to take a visible toll on Emma's small body. Her hair had already fallen out, but now her skin appeared paler, and she was often so fatigued she couldn't leave her bed. One day, when Shaq walked in, he found Emma curled up on the bed, her tired eyes gazing blankly out the window. Hey, Captain, Shaq greeted, trying to keep his voice cheerful. He held up a colorful bag. I brought treasures today. Want to guess what's inside? Emma turned her head slightly, but instead of her usual smile, she just gave a faint shake of her head. Shaq sat down beside her, carefully opening the bag. "I've got pizza, the extra cheesy kind. And look, comic books. Here's Batman versus Joker. But if you'd like, I can tell the story like it's a basketball game. Who do you think wins?" Emma tried to smile, but it quickly faded. "I don't want pizza or comic books," she murmured. "I'm too tired, Uncle Shaq." Shaq's heart clenched, but he quickly masked his pain with a bright expression. "That's okay. If you don't want pizza now, we'll save it for later. And as for the Batman versus Joker game, you just need to listen. I'll make it the best play-by-play ever." He began narrating the story, his deep, warm voice filled with humor. Occasionally, he mimed exaggerated basketball moves, pretending to dunk on an imaginary Joker. It earned a small laugh from Emma. But as the story ended, she sighed deeply, her eyes clouded with sadness. "Uncle Shaq," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "if I don't make it, will you be sad?" Her question hit Shaq like a knife to the chest. He froze for a moment, his large hands clenching as if to hold back the surge of emotion. But he wouldn't let Emma see his pain. "Emma," he said, his voice steady and firm, "I would be sad. But do you know what? No one gives up when Uncle Shaq is on their team. We're a team, and our team always wins, no matter how tough the game gets." Emma looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But I'm so tired, Uncle Shaq. I'm afraid I'll let everyone down." Shaq leaned closer, taking her small hand in his massive one. "Listen to me, Emma. Everyone gets tired. Everyone gets scared. But what matters is that we keep going. Every single day you fight, you make me so proud. And no one, especially you, has ever let anyone down. You're the bravest person I've ever met." His words brought a faint smile to Emma's face, though tears still glistened in her eyes. But the challenges didn't stop. Emma's immune system began to falter, leaving her vulnerable to infections. One evening, after Shaq had left the hospital, he received a frantic call from Mrs. Margaret. "Shaq, Emma's spiked a high fever and has been moved to isolation for monitoring. The doctors say it's a dangerous complication from the chemotherapy." Shaq rushed to the hospital immediately. Upon arrival, he was instructed to wear protective gear before entering the isolation room. Seeing Emma lying there, her tiny body almost swallowed by the thick blankets and surrounded by machines, made his heart ache. He sat beside her, unable to touch her, but letting his eyes speak volumes. "Emma," he said through the mask, his deep voice breaking the stillness, "you're doing so well. Just hang in there a little longer. Everything will be okay." She slowly opened her eyes to look at him, her lips barely moving. "Promise?" Shaq placed his hand over his chest. "I promise." After several tense days, Emma began to recover. Though still fragile, her spirit seemed lighter, buoyed by Shaq's unwavering support. One afternoon, Shaq entered her room to find Emma attempting to sit up. On the bedside table was a basketball signed by him, placed carefully as if it were a symbol of hope. "You know," Shaq said with a warm smile, "I just came up with a new drill. It's called bed dribbling. Want to give it a try?" Emma chuckled, this time a genuine laugh. "Okay, but you have to help me. I can't do it on my own." Shaq leaned in, his eyes sparkling with joy. "That's why captains always have co-captains, Emma. We'll do this together." The room filled with soft laughter as they practiced their dribbling drill, and in that moment, Shaq felt they had won another small victory in their long, arduous journey. Spring sunlight filtered through the hospital window, illuminating the room where Emma had spent countless days fighting bravely. Beside her bed, a basketball signed by Shaquille O'Neal sat neatly, a symbol of hope that never wavered. Shaq walked in, his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorway. Seeing Emma sitting up in bed, her face rosier and her smile brighter than ever, he felt a weight lift off his chest. "Looks like my team captain is stronger than ever," Shaq teased, his deep voice warm and comforting. Emma laughed, her eyes sparkling. "I told you I'd win, Uncle Shaq." After months of chemotherapy and radiation, Emma finally received the long-awaited news from her doctors. The cancer cells were under control, and she was entering recovery. Though the road ahead remained long, being discharged from the hospital and returning to the orphanage marked a major milestone. Mrs. Margaret and the orphanage staff decided to throw a small welcome-back party to celebrate Emma's return. When Shaq heard about it, he not only insisted on attending, but also planned a big surprise for everyone. That day, the orphanage buzzed with joy. Colorful balloons were strung everywhere, and children's laughter echoed through the cozy playground. Emma appeared in a simple white dress, her familiar basketball cap perched on her head. Her friends cheered as she arrived, and Emma couldn't hide her emotion as the crowd clapped, welcoming her home. Shaq, dressed in a simple suit that still couldn't disguise his towering presence, stepped up beside Emma. Holding a microphone, he flashed a radiant smile. "Today, we're not just welcoming Captain Emma back," he began, his deep voice carrying across the crowd, "but we're also celebrating her incredible courage and resilience. Emma, you're not just a hero to yourself, you're an inspiration to all of us." Applause erupted, but Shaq wasn't done. He raised his hand to signal for quiet and continued. "And to make sure that every child here, not just Emma, has a safe home, a place where you never have to worry about your health or your future, I have some good news to share." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "I've purchased a new plot of land, much bigger, and we're going to build a modern orphanage with an on-site medical clinic. This will be a place where you'll always be cared for, loved, and never have to face challenges alone." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Mrs. Margaret stood silently, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. O'Neal, you truly are a miracle for us." Shaq smiled but quickly turned his attention back to Emma. "What do you think, Captain? Ready to lead a new basketball team there?" Emma looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, feeling the warmth and safety of this giant man's embrace. "You're my real hero, Uncle Shaq," she said, her voice trembling but full of sincerity. Shaq knelt down, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No, Emma, you're the real hero. I'm just lucky to stand by your side on this journey." The party continued with laughter and joy filling the air. Emma ran around with her friends, her legs now stronger, her smile never fading. From a corner of the playground, Shaq watched her, his heart brimming with happiness. He knew this was just the beginning, not just for Emma, but for all the children who deserved a chance at a better life. As the afternoon sky turned golden with the setting sun, Shaq felt like it was a brand new dawn, promising a future filled with hope and miracles. The sun shone brightly over the expansive land, where a newly constructed building stood prominently with its vibrant, modern design against a lush, green backdrop. A large sign at the gate bore the warm words, "Shaq's House of Hope." Hundreds of people gathered outside, eager children, staff members from the shelter, generous donors, and those who had followed the journey of Shaquille O'Neal and Emma. The atmosphere was brimming with joy and anticipation, as if everyone was witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. Shaq stood on a stage set up right in front of the gates, dressed in a sharp yet understated suit. Beside him were Mrs. Margaret and Emma, the little girl who now looked healthier than ever in a lovely blue dress, sporting her signature basketball cap. Shaq bent down to Emma, offering her an encouraging smile before stepping up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent instantly, every eye fixed on the towering man who had changed so many lives. "Hello, everyone," he began, his deep, powerful voice resonating across the space. "Today is a special day, not just for me, but for every child here, for Emma, and for this entire community. Shaq's House of Hope is not just a shelter. It is a promise, a commitment that we will never turn our backs on those in need." The audience broke into applause, but Shaq raised a hand, signaling that he had more to say. He paused, taking a deep breath. "I used to think success was about what we achieved for ourselves, titles, money, fame, but this journey has taught me something. True success lies in how we use those things to make a difference. Emma, her friends, and every child here have shown me that each of us has the power to change the world." He glanced over at Emma, his expression softening. "I want to say this to you, Emma. You've taught me that you don't have to be a giant to do great things. You are the real hero, and today, I hope this home becomes the starting point for your big dreams and those of your friends." Emma blushed, but her smile shone brighter than the sunlight overhead. Turning back to the crowd, Shaq's voice rose with strength and emotion. "We all have the power to change the world, one small act at a time. And today, we've done this together." After his speech, Shaq, Mrs. Margaret, and Emma cut the ribbon. The large gates swung open to reveal the interior, a campus filled with newly constructed buildings, a spacious playground, and a state-of-the-art medical clinic to ensure that no child would lack proper health care. Emma and her friends quickly dashed inside, their laughter echoing everywhere. Children played on the brand-new basketball court, climbed on brightly colored jungle gyms, and excitedly explored every corner of the place they could now call home. As the event wound down, Shaq stood off to the side watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Margaret approached, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Shaq, you haven't just changed Emma's life. You've changed the future for so many children here," she said, her voice trembling. "This home isn't just a shelter, it's a symbol of hope." Shaq smiled, his broad shoulders seeming to relax after months of hard work. "I didn't do this alone, Mrs. Margaret. It's the work of everyone who believed we could make a difference." "What's next for you?" Mrs. Margaret asked. Shaq looked up at the clear blue sky, his eyes reflecting a deep sense of purpose. "The journey continues. This foundation won't stop here. I want to expand it nationwide to give children everywhere a better chance." Mrs. Margaret nodded, admiration shining in her eyes. Later that afternoon, just before leaving, Emma ran up to Shaq. She hugged him tightly, her head tilted up, eyes sparkling. "I don't know how to thank you enough," she said softly. Shaq knelt down, his gaze kind and steady. "You've already thanked me, Emma, by never giving up." Emma beamed, then ran off to join her friends. Standing tall, Shaq watched her small figure disappear into the vibrant playground, his heart swelling with the belief that this was only the beginning. With Shaq's House of Hope, A brighter future was unfolding, not just for Emma, but for thousands of children. And Shaq, with his enormous heart, was ready to keep walking this path, a journey to change the world through small yet powerful acts of love. The journey of Shaquille O'Neal and Emma is not just a story of compassion and resilience. It's proof of the power of love and community. From the early challenges to the grand opening of Shaq's House of Hope, every small action has contributed to creating a monumental change. So, what do you think about this story? If you had the chance, what would you do to help those around you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring and meaningful stories. Thank you for being here, and see you in the next video.